Hello, everybody, and welcome to another podcast for the Data Vault Innovators community. My name is Richard Harris. I'm from Ignition Data, and today we're going to talk about privacy, a very exciting topic I'm sure you're all thrilled to be learning about. But the reality is privacy and the protection of data is now a critical component of an effective data management strategy. And so with the upcoming changes to the Privacy Act looming, we thought now would be a good idea to maybe revisit what our current regulatory framework and key issues are, take a look at what we think is going to be front and center for the new Act and what that means for us in the Data Vault community. Joining me today, James Hartwright from Cognition Studio. James, please say hi.
Hi. So the privacy side, I've been actively involved in Europe, in the US, and in Australia, New Zealand, and from both sides. So I've been consulting, which is my day job, to clients, but I've also actually had to implement a number of the Privacy Act regulations for some large organizations. So hopefully I can give both sides of the fence of the sort of things that we need to do.
Indeed. And I myself have taught a course for the Fundraising Institute of Australia in privacy and protecting donor data. So between the two of us, I think we've got quite a lot of experience in how to use data and how to protect it, striking that balance between, I think, promoting and protecting data at the same time. So why don't we start off then with the basics, really. When we're talking about the Privacy Act, we're talking about personal data. What do we mean when we're talking about personal data right now?
Yeah, so it's the sort of things that you would think of as being personal. So name, address, date of birth, email address, phone number. But it also extends to things like images that can identify you as an individual, signatures, your voice print, any of those contact center recordings will be deemed personal data. And then stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think of, things like a customer number that gets printed on an envelope, if you still get envelopes, letters through, anything that's an external number that other people might be able to see, that's also deemed personal data.
And we're also living in a world where, in the digital side, that a cookie attached to an identity could also be considered personal data now.
Cookies, IP addresses,
It always comes down to whether you can really use that data to identify and differentiate an individual. It doesn't even matter now whether you know that individual's name. If you can treat that person as an individual, then we can consider that personal information. So for those of us who've been operating in the traditional sense of name, address, email, etc., and maybe not given thought to that, that's where the law has evolved even over the last few years as we've gotten better and better at using information to differentiate down to an audience of one now. And so what about, James, sensitive data? How does that differentiate from personal, in your opinion?
Yeah, there's within the Australian Privacy Act and in GDPR, the European one, there are special categories of customer data that deemed sensitive data. That's different to things like commercially sensitive data, which still needs security and control, but isn't necessarily under the strong regulation of law that sensitive data in against personal data. So it's sort of a subset of that personal data, and it's stuff that is really set out there to go that this data, if it's that it shouldn't be used for profiling analysis to discriminate individuals. So this is sexual orientation, racial origin, religion, any associations or unions that you're part of, but down to biometric information. So DNA that is potentially leading you to some genetic predisposition to illness. So all of those things that are, that would be discriminatory if used. Now you could say that other data in around the personal side of your photo, etc., would be deemed sensitive. It's not under law and not under the Australian Privacy Act, but it is a special category. And the way, as I say, that I tend to use it is could this be used in a discriminatory way? If it could, let's deem it sensitive data.
I think it's worthwhile as well to point out that we're using the word discriminatory, and in the pejorative sense, of course, there's a negative connotation that you might use that information to negatively impact an individual in some way. But of course, discriminatory can be you're selecting someone positively, i.e., you're using that information to include them in, say, a marketing campaign. But that the law doesn't differentiate there. If you're still discriminating, i.e., selecting someone on that information, then that is contrary to the Act as it stands. So again, for those of us who are working mostly with customer data to support marketing campaigns or communication to our base. These are things that we've got to be very cognizant of. That are we using information that potentially we shouldn't do, even if we think we're using it for a good reason?
Yeah,
That's
or what we
good.
believe is a good reason.
What we believe is a
Yeah.
good reason. And look, you touched on there in terms of the use, and we'll talk about ethical use of data a bit later on. But what right now then is our responsibility when we're talking about personal and sensitive information? What does the law say? What are the regulations that we have to be aware of when thinking about how to manage data?
Yeah. Well, there's under the Australian focus, there are currently 13 privacy principles under GDPR, under the Californian New Privacy Act, the CPRA, which has taken over from the CCPA, and most of the laws that are in there in privacy around the world have controls that you need to follow around capturing data, storing data, sharing data, and retaining data. So when you're capturing data, that you need to inform the customer what you're capturing and what you're going to do with it. When you're storing data, that you're storing it in a secure way according to the sensitivity. Sorry, I've used the sensitivity, the classification of that data. Is it personal, sensitive, etc.? The sharing, that you need to inform the customer who you might be sharing that data with and give them the option to opt out from that or not even opt into it. And then retain. So there's a piece there around, all right, I got this data 10 years ago. When you signed up for a newsletter, you still got that. Well, why? There needs to be a business reason for why you're keeping and holding on to this data. And the majority is around that there's a continuing exchange, contract, to use the more legal word, between us and the customer or prospect, that you're still giving them newsletter emails or anything like that. But then the other is that there is a legal requirement. So there's a lot in financial services that says you need to retain all of this data for 7 years, so that if you get hauled over the coals or this person is found to be money laundering or something like that, you can trace it through. But capturing, storing, sharing, and retaining are the sort of the core around the Australian Privacy Act and others.
Sure.
The other thing on top of the Privacy Act is giving the consumer the right to see what data an organization holds on them. And this is still restricted to personal and sensitive data, but to apply what in European terms is called a data subject access request. And that's an individual can come in and say, here are my credentials, here's my email address or my name. Please return me all of the personal data that you have on me, and give it to me in a usable form. So don't give me 84 pages of printout, but just give me something that's in a flat file or something. So that's the coverage of the Australian privacy principles as they stand today.
Great, and it's worthwhile noting that the principles are not prescriptive. So when we talk about some of these things, the law says, for example, people have the right to correct any errors within their data, and that you can't charge them for that, for example. But the law doesn't tell you how you should do that. So there's case law that kind of drives where the reasonableness comes in, because if you're a small organization with a team of 2 or 3 people managing a relatively small database, how you go about facilitating that and meeting that obligation, of course, is going to be very different than if you're a multinational bank, for example, with almost endless budget and technology capability. So that's an important thing to consider as well. There is a context that you can apply to how you meet these obligations, and whether it's reasonable, of course, is where the courts will eventually come in and define that. So yeah, I think one of the ways that we see, obviously, the management and protection of data being the largest issue right now is the scale and the size of the data breaches that we're seeing. Why don't we touch on that for a second? Because we've seen some quite high-profile breaches just recently in Australia, and I know that it's one of the consistent statistics that come up from my research that the vast majority of data breaches can be, in some way, shape, or form, put back down to some form of human error, whether it's error in how something was architected or just somebody doing something as silly as putting something on a USB stick and leaving it on the seat of a bus or a taxi.
Yeah.
What's your point of view on that?
Yeah. You could, of course, just go, well, it's the hackers. It's the hackers' fault. That if there weren't hackers trying to break into my systems, then all things would be rosy. But yeah, in truth, most of it is combinations of human error. So, for example, there was one where employee details were stored on a historic system for a reward scheme, looked after by a third-party vendor, and had been running. I think it was finished in 2017. And for whatever reason, that system had just sat there with the data in it from 2017. And then actually somebody managed to get in there. So yeah, that's human error around that retention piece that I said. Is there is zero business reason for us to hold on to reward scheme data from 2017 that's no longer active. So you should just be deleting it, not holding on to it. Others in around, the classic of putting, hey, here's my user ID and password and putting it up on the screen, not implementing single sign-on and two-factor authentication. That just, allowing people to go with natural human nature of making things easy. But the vast majority have been things where, through not thinking about those pieces in storing, sharing, and retaining data, that people have managed to get in and see data and draw out data that they shouldn't really have done. And that's the majority of those large breaches have been that. Yes, USB sticks, yes, printouts. That's things that are not good, but they're not most of the major breaches. Most of the major breaches are things like where people have copied production data down into development databases and then gone, hey, it's only development, let me share that with a third party, but it's real active data. So it's taking care that I always go to those privacy principles and the law. These are strong guide rails for you about what you should do looking after data, and applying more of those of saying, well, here's personal data, who really needs to get access to it? And you put that down to a very, very few people who really see that personal data in bulk.
And for those of us in the data warehousing space, which of course we all are, there is a very strong argument for asking the question, does personal information need to be actually stored in the data warehouse?
Yeah.
When you really get down to it, a lot of that information, the metadata, is just as powerful. You can index or obfuscate that data in a meaningful way.
Totally.
You don't need to necessarily make that part of your data warehousing ecosystem.
And in Data Vault, there are already principles that we have, which is where you've got something like personal data, you segregate it out. And your next bit, as you said, Richard, is, well, I've segregated it out, put it away. If I can draw the metadata out, if I can take date of birth and just extract year of birth, that's still usable in analytics and slicing and dicing of reports. But I've not drawn out the raw personal data that would be potentially bad if it got exposed.
Yeah, of course. And look, the other thing as well I think it's worth touching on is when errors do occur, an approach that I've seen work very well is really a no blame review. You're not looking for the individual that made a mistake, because at the end of the day, these are all systemic issues. The process, was it followed or not? And if it wasn't followed, then the question needs to be raised: how do we put in safeguards to prevent someone from not following? Are there additional reviews? Human beings are fallible. We make mistakes. We have good days and bad. And we are under pressures to deliver to timelines a lot of the time, which can sometimes cause us to seek those shortcuts. So, if breaches occur when you're looking at these things, coming at it from a how do we prevent this from a systemic approach is often probably the most helpful way to do it. Before we talk about the upcoming changes, I think a good bridge between the two is the ethical use of data. We're seeing a lot in the analytics and data science space coming to the fore now, and again, ChatGPT seems to dominate the conversation about: are we training our AIs in using ethical data? Are we seeing biases come through in our algorithms because the data itself is biased? So maybe can we talk a little bit about, from your point of view, where does the role of ethics play, even under the current data management ethos?
Yeah. I know there's the most basic, coming back to that, capture and use. So the some analysis that was done on email addresses. So an individual has supplied their email address for you to do send them emails, send them content. That's an expected use of the data. But most people who set up their own personal email address will have had something like, well, I put my first name, my last name, and my year of birth in to construct a nice, unique email address. Now, you could go, oh, well, look, I can do some great analytics and draw those out and go, hey, so it says Donald Trump 1946 at gmail.com. Well, I know Donald's a first name. I know Trump's a last name, and 1946 is probably his year of birth. It's about 80% true, by the way, that sort of structure. That drawing that data out and using it is actually not, it's breaking those principles. And if you take it to the next level, it starts moving into the unethical nature. It's you're using data for a purpose other than what it was supplied by the individual for. And I think that's probably one of the core pieces. That the second one around the unethical use, well, there's the discriminatory part is, anytime you're using anything that's deemed in that sensitive area, you either don't do it at all, don't put those attributes into your analytical model to generate things, or if you're doing it, do it with great care, understanding, and a realization, and probably an acceptance from the individual that you're going to use that sort of data.
I think that's more and more where a lot of it comes into making sure you've got the permissions from the individuals, at the point of data capture, and of course that you start to build into your metadata, your data dictionaries, your data catalogs, etc. For what purpose, what permitted purpose you have that information. So people coming in and wanting to, grab some of that data, know what they can and can't do with it. And it's interesting, the power of the name, because of course from someone's first name you can pretty accurately derive their gender, and quite often it gives you an age band as well.
Yes,
we know
indeed.
that someone called Ruby is probably going to be on the older side.
Totally.
Someone called Beyonce, probably a little bit younger. So the name can be quite an interesting data from which to derive a whole bunch of other insights, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so look, we know that the Privacy Act is going through an overhaul. We know that it's going to be looking a lot more like GDPR. What do you see as probably the major change that's going to be impacting us when it's finally written?
Yeah, the biggest one I see, based on my personal experience with working in organizations and consulting gigs I do, there's a structure called right for erasure, or more commonly known as right to be forgotten. And what that is an individual can say, I no longer have a business relationship with you. Please delete all of my personal data through all of your systems. and you must do that. So this is already present in GDPR. It's already present in a number of other acts. I see it's actually in the report that this is going to be applied into Australia. In truth, it's already starting to make its way through. Consumer data right in Australia for financial services, etc. If you sign up to the Consumer Data Right program, you have to implement right to be forgotten. So it's coming. It's definitely coming. And in truth, it's another one of those where a sort of a reinforcement of a retention policy. Individuals want and should have control of how their personal data is used. So if they're putting in a request to your organization saying, please delete any knowledge of me that you have, we as organizations should respect that.
Yeah. Now, when you say delete, obviously one of the big challenges in this day and age with cloud computing and distributed networks, et cetera, is it reasonable to think we are actually going to delete that data? Or is it going to be enough, do you think, that, again, you mentioned the data vault methodology, that we could carve that data out into a separate satellite within our warehouse and keep it so that it's not accessible within the organization, but you can still retain it? As you say, for some organizations, there might be legal reasons to do so.
Yeah. There are some processes, as you've said, that we've just talked about in ways that you might be able to fulfill this. And that's all cool when you're talking about that, the name, the address, the email address. But that thing that I said, customer numbers and things, those customer numbers are commonly used as linkage. They could turn into business keys in Data Vault. So you actually have to think about this in design and possibly reorientate some of the things that you've already put if you've already deployed your vault. So the right to be forgotten, I've not seen it fully tested in law, but yeah, effectively you must rip through all of your systems, your operational systems and your lakes and your warehouses, and remove any instance of, or properly obfuscate one-way hash, not reversible, not brute forceable. You need to remove that data from your systems. So in Vault, we need to think about that design. So if we've got a business key that is naturally using something like an email address as linkage, we need to build a key lookup table that turns that into some properly incrementing ID. We need to take that incrementing ID and use that as our business key through the linkage. So that if we get a right to be forgotten, we can remove that link from the lookup table. We've still got all of that history, all of the profiling, all of the analysis, all of the ability to see behaviors. But what we haven't had to do is to go through all of our records and all of our type 2 insert only to try and overwrite that data, which if we're running in an insert only mode, you can't do. So all of that type 2 stuff, we've got to do it all in design. And in coming back to the data lakes, if you've got a data lake that is recording like a file per hour, a file per day, you need to seriously think about how you manage that, because taking each of those files, running through, finding that record, recreating the file and redropping it, there's all sorts of issues in terms of consistency and flow that we've got to do. So that piece of right to be forgotten, especially in the data warehousing environment, is best done by design, and making those forward linking, obfuscating, removing the metadata, setting the aside, so that when you apply right to be forgotten, it's as simple as possible, still allowing you to do your analysis.
Fantastic, thank you. And look, certainly it's going to be an interesting update to the Act. I think I agree, this right to be forgotten, and therefore that need to have a strong lineage of your data through the organization is going to be paramount. I'm sure there's going to be some other interesting changes. So when the Act is finally published, we might do a quick update on this. So James, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. For those of you who might be a bit worried about whether you've architected in quite the right way and if you're ready for these things, we're seeing a lot more activity through our Data Vault review service and our data maturity assessment which is another consulting engagement that we can come in and have a look at what you're doing and maybe advise on where you might have opportunities to improve how you're managing PII and your sensitive data. Certainly, it's top of mind for a lot of our clients at the moment. It seems to be driving a lot of concern and a need for a review of really the whole data governance approach that organizations are taking. So hopefully this has been a helpful session and a reminder to take a look at where you might have those exposures and take care of them sooner rather than later. Again, James, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for your time today. We'll talk to you again soon.